If, like me, you're a fan of using GTO Wizard AI to break down big hands that you see on TV games, then this video is going to be a great example of that for you. We're going to break down a spot from a recent episode of High Stakes Poker, and it's going to be a pot that reached almost $1 million. So stick with me and we'll discuss this hand in detail. So the hand in question took place between Justin Gavri in the cutoff and Brandon Adams in the big blind, and it's part of High Stakes Poker Season 14. Now, it's a pretty deep stack situation. They're playing 1K, 2K blinds with the 2K big blind ante, and Justin's going to open to 2.5 big blinds in the cutoff with pocket deuces. Now, for the analysis you're going to see in this video, I have used 200 big blind MTT ranges. That's pretty close to the right stack size here because they were about 230 big blinds deep in this hand. So we could use the deeper stack chip EV cash ranges, but those don't have antes. So 200 big blind MTT is a pretty reasonable set of ranges to use. Now, Brandon Adams does call queens pre-flop here, which is an interesting decision in itself. So we'll talk about that in a second. And he takes a check raise flop, bet turn, bet river, call river jam line with top full house on queen 3 deuce 4-4. Now that seems relatively trivial until you consider that Justin actually had another full house, so full house over full house, generating a $933,000 pot, and obviously one of the bigger pots you'll see on a televised poker game. So let's look at some of the key questions we're seeking to answer from analyzing this hand. First of all, what's with Brandon's just call pre-flop with pocket queens? Isn't this a little bit tight, a little bit passive? Could there be a reason behind it that we're not aware of? Secondly, is there anything unusual about the flop? Because as you'll see, the flop action seems relatively straightforward, but maybe there's something about it we could figure out that's a little unusual. Thirdly, did Brandon size correctly on the turn in the river? Were his bet sizes in keeping with what the solver might tell us was appropriate for the range construction that we see in this spot? And of course, what are Brandon's bluffs? What bluffs is he going to have when taking this line on this board? And finally, is there any conceivable way that Justin Gavri can avoid getting stacked here? Can he maybe avoid raising the river or not raise the river, maybe only just call? Let's take a look. So first of all, let's tackle Brandon's pre-flop play here. Now, as I mentioned, we've got the 200 big blind MTT ranges that we're going to use. And as you can see, these ranges have a 2.4x open size from the cutoff, so pretty close to the 2.5 that was actually used. And of course, they have big blind ante, or at least equivalent to big blind ante because they're 8-handed. So Justin's going to open, and pocket deuces, of course, pretty trivial open here, very reasonable. And in the big blind, as you can see, for Brandon, pocket queens is actually pure 3-bet. Now, in this case, if we look at the actual EV differences, we can see that queens is winning an additional 2.6% of the pot by 3-betting compared to calling. However, that's not a ton because we're only dealing with a pretty small pre-flop pot at this point. And if you look at pocket jacks is mixing 3-bets and calls here. So queens is kind of on the threshold where mixing calls is probably not a disaster, especially because we do want to have some protection in our calling range pre-flop so that we're not especially capped on certain board textures. So it is a little bit of a passive play to just call pre-flop, but I can understand it because we're really only 1 pip away from hands that might want to mix calls in the first place. And if you look at, for example, what Brandon does against an under the gun open, queens is very much a mix versus an under the gun open. So it's really only the fact that it's a cutoff open that makes it not a mix. And of course, if Justin was perhaps a little bit tighter than average in the cutoff, we don't really know if Brandon perceives him that way, but if that was the case, there's actually a pretty good argument for mixing queens from this spot. So not really a particularly disastrous play, but it is an interesting one. So ultimately, pocket queens should be a pure 3-bet at this depth in this particular spot, but the EV loss, not very big. And if Justin is a little bit tighter than perhaps what he should be, then the hand is going to be mixing calls and 3-bets. So actually a pretty reasonable call pre-flop here. I wouldn't have really said the same about kings. I think kings would probably be a bit too strong to just call, but queens certainly, not too far away from being a mix here, so reasonable call. Let's now take a look at how both players approach the flop here. So I've run a version of this sim that accounts for the bet sizes that were actually used. And of course, I've also node-locked Brandon to not donk bet the flop at all here because it's not really realistic to think that he would do. So just for security here, we've locked him to donk bet nothing. And then Justin uses a roughly 1/3 pot c-bet size, and as you can see, it's a pretty clear range bet for Justin here. Nothing really wrong with range betting, 99% frequency. We may as well just round that up to 100. So range betting is going to work very well for him. Not really too much to say about that because it is a board that's really favorable for his range. Brandon, of course, isn't defending much 3x and deuce x, so he's going to miss this board quite a lot. However, Brandon does check raise. However, of course, on this particular flop, both players flopped a set. So naturally, Brandon does check raise, and he does come with the size of about 4x the bet here. In percentage of pot terms, this was about 57% of pot. It's a little bit smaller than what the solver wanted. When I originally ran this, the solver wanted to go to about 2/3 pot, slightly bigger than this, but really not a big change here. This is a very good size, very reasonable size. And as you can see, Brandon's check raising range is surprisingly wide here against this range bet. He's got about a 14% frequency, 108 combos, so a lot of different stuff. I did paint pocket queens into the preflop range here. I forced him to call with it at some small frequency. And when that happens, when we do have queens in the calling range, he's of course going to check raise it at a high rate. Now, you'll notice here that unlike some spots, there's not really a lot of protection in the check calling range. These strongest hands that are check calling are hands like a tiny frequency of ace queen, king queen, but really all the two pair except for a little bit of queen deuce of spades is check raising. And the reason for that simply is that when we're this deep, the ability to get value from the top end of our value range starts to supersede protecting our check calling range. So Brandon isn't doing a lot of trapping or check calling with strong hands here. He's just check raising, and he's doing it at full frequency with top set. Now, in terms of Justin's response versus the raise here, you can see he's actually supposed to 3-bet the flop at a surprising rate. However, there's a very specific reason for this. If you look at how I originally set up the tree, what I did is I had it set to only allow 4 bets per street. And at this depth, you have to be very careful about that because as you can see, he's supposed to click back the flop quite a lot, but the reason for that is that the response from Brandon is only going to be a call, a fold, or a almost 6x pot shove, which isn't really realistic. If I now allow Brandon to have a non-all-in raise size, so if I give Brandon, say, a raise size of something in the region of 50% pot, 52%-ish, something like that, then now what's going to happen is the frequency that Justin's going to 3-bet the flop is going to go down. In fact, he's very rarely doing it at all because his range specifically doesn't want to face a 4-bet on the flop. Previously, facing a jam or just a call, not really that much of an issue because the jam is so huge, and of course the call is a better option for Brandon. But when we allow him to 4-bet to half pot or so, not much clicking back going on from Justin here. So probably pretty reasonable to assume that very little to no clicking was probably going to happen in real life here. So to summarize both players' flop approach, range betting is going to be fine for Justin here. It's a very good board for his range overall. Brandon's check raise might be a tiny bit smaller than optimal, but really it's going to be fine as long as he finds a pretty high check raising frequency here. And crucially, only allowing 4 bets per street made Justin want to click back the flop a lot because he's not facing very many re-raises. But when we remove that, now he doesn't really want to do very much clicking back at all. But either way, no matter what option we pick here, Brandon gets to check raise the flop quite often with a fairly wide range, a pretty diverse range, and a range that does include most of his strong hands, 2 pairs and sets at pretty much full frequency. So interesting flop spot. So next we're going to look at the turn. And to start this analysis, what I've done is I've forced Brandon to use the size that he actually used in-game, which is full pot. Now that was a little bigger than what the solver initially wanted to go with. It wanted to go with about 3/4 pot, but it'd be splitting hairs to get too focused on this. So I think full pot is going to be fine here. And if we look at the construction, pocket queens is actually almost a pure check here on the turn. This is going to be to protect the checking range, and it's going to be because queens actually double blocks that top pair stuff that Brandon is trying to get value from. So it's interesting to see that this hand is supposed to check. He's also supposed to check some 6-5, some pocket threes, some pocket deuces, so his checking range is supposed to be very protected. Now, let's see what happens if we force him to bet all of his 2-pair plus here. That's going to then allow us to see a little bit more of a realistic perception of how his range evolves going into the river. So we're just going to use the node locking tool, and we're going to put everything in the straight set and 2-pair category into a bet, and then we're going to just hit node lock. So we're not going to force him to specifically bet other regions of bluffs. We're just going to allow him to compensate for the fact that he's always forced to bet 2-pair plus. And naturally, you can see this is going to up his betting frequency with a lot of his bluffs because he has to have more bluffs to compensate. And it's added a lot more polarity to the betting range. You can see there's some pretty weak bluffs down here that are choosing to bet. Stuff like 8-5 of clubs, 8-5 of diamonds, hands like that really just have a 5. They just have an open-ender and a straight blocker. So he's now forced to bet pretty aggressively with some of those bluffs here because he's always betting his value. If we look at Justin's response, as you can see, there is a certain amount of clicking back going on here as well, because we are still pretty deep here at 200 big blinds plus. He's not necessarily always going to be able to get stacks in by just calling, but pocket deuces is a good hand to just call. It unblocks all the straights, but it's doing very, very well against all the bluffs. So it actually plays quite well against a polar range here. So just calling with pocket deuces, and of course the majority of the time with threes, going to work pretty well for Justin. So everything's all good so far from both players, I think. So to summarize the turn, full pot was a little bigger than what the solver wanted to use here, but not by a big margin. And Brandon's construction is not particularly polar by default here, but if we do force him to bet 2-pair plus, it does start to become a bit more polar. He's betting at higher frequencies with some of his weakest bluffs, some of the 5x that doesn't have spades and so on. Pocket queens itself actually prefers checking the turn, but as you can see, we did force it to make a bet here so that we can analyze the river with more clarity. And the bluffs that Brandon's using here are mostly 5x and 6x hands. A lot of those gut shots, straight draws, spades, things like that. So nothing super lacking in equity, but also some pretty weak hands when it comes to only being able to have a flush draw sometimes, for example. They might only have 8 outs, 9 outs going to the river in a lot of cases. So Justin does call, and then the river is the 4 of hearts, which pairs the board, gives both players a full house. Kind of a brutal river for Justin, obviously. Now, in Brandon's spot here, I've given him 3 bet size options. I've given him a jam for almost 3x pot. I've given him the size that he actually did use, which is a little below pot. And then I've given him a smaller sort of block type size of 25 big blinds into 62.5. And as you can see, the preferred sizing here is the full pot size. So it looks like his size is a very good choice here. And in particular, if you look at the range that's picking that size, it's a pretty robust value betting range of a lot of straights and a lot of trips. Now, his full houses are doing that a little bit too, but as you can see, his full houses are maybe preferring to jam in this spot, considering they can get max value from all of those straights and things like that in this way. Now, once again, pocket queens is actually pretty much a pure check here. So it really seems like double blocking top pair is giving Brandon an incentive to check with this specific hand. But let's force him to bet it and see how that affects things. So as you can see, not changing a ton, but let's look at Justin's response. Well, realistically, as you can imagine, all of his full houses are jamming this river, right? His full houses are strong enough that they are jamming every single time here. In fact, even a straight is jamming at a small frequency. However, this is dependent not on the exact range that Brandon has when he bets the river, but it's dependent on the range that he actually calls the jam with. As you can see, Justin jams for about 70% pot, and with this sizing, Brandon is actually supposed to call a straight, a pretty high frequency here. 6-5 he's always supposed to call, and ace-5 is supposed to call quite often. Now, if Brandon wasn't doing this, it might change Justin's response. Let's take a look. If we lock Brandon to fold everything worse than a full house on the river, then naturally, it's logical to assume that jamming pocket deuces no longer works very well. So before we lock Brandon's response against the jam, we actually have to eliminate these other bet sizes on the river, because what's going to happen is we're going to see certain hands, if we force them to fold to a jam after they bet one size, well, now they're going to start doing something different in order to make sure that they don't end up having to fold. So what we're going to do in this case is we're actually going to lock pocket queens to bet, and then we're also going to lock everything else, because we don't want Brandon's out of position strategy to change once we force him to fold to the jam, let's say. But what we do want is we now want, facing this bet, we're going to get rid of the click back size from Justin here, because it's probably not realistic that he would have that in game. And we're just going to lock Brandon's response against the jam. As you can see, straights and trips calling quite a bit here. But let's imagine they don't do that. Let's imagine everything below a full house basically always folds. And now we're going to see that most likely pocket deuces no longer has a reason to jam. And the funny thing here is that plenty of other hands now do. In fact, hands like a random queen are just jamming as a bluff. Jack 9 suited's jamming as a bluff. Kings is jamming as a bluff. All sorts of hands now are jamming as a bluff if Brandon's actually folding a straight. So it completely reverses Justin's strategy on his head. And instead of jamming with full houses for value and then jamming a tiny bit of some straights, also some bluffs, he's now not jamming pocket deuces because it's the lowest full house that can't beat any other full houses. And in fact, he's jamming with a ton of bluffs. He's basically jamming his whole range as a bluff because Brandon is actually overfolding to this jam reasonably significantly. So completely flips the spot around. But in essence here, the only way that Justin would be able to get away from this spot is if he thinks that Brandon is never calling the river jam with a straight, which probably isn't an easy assumption to make in this spot, but given the size of the pot, it might be. Who knows? People do tend to make big folds in some of these huge pots from time to time. So if our question here is, can Justin ever avoid getting stacked somehow on this river? The short answer is probably no, because it's almost impossible to build a range for Brandon that allows Justin to not jam here. So to analyze the river here, the question becomes, can Justin ever avoid getting stacked somehow? And the real answer is probably not. It's very difficult to build a range for Brandon that allows Justin to maybe just call on this river. The only thing that could make that happen is if Brandon was not calling a jam with a straight or with trips. But in that instance, that would now mean that Justin had a huge incentive to be bluffing with all kinds of hands by jamming that river. Kings, Queen X, basically everything that gets to that river that isn't a full house or a straight now actually has incentive to jam as a bluff because of how much Brandon would be folding. So that's a really interesting insight on that river. So to draw some overall conclusions here, both players' lines were pretty solid throughout the hand. Brandon's preflop call with pocket queens doesn't really substantially alter the spot very much, but the turn does change the spot a little bit because Brandon's bluffs were a bit non-intuitive in some cases, and it was a little bit difficult to imagine maybe some of those hands being found as bluffs. But Justin does have to just call most of his sets on the turn, so just calling with deuces there when the turn brings the straight, very reasonable. On the river, it's really, really difficult for Justin to ever avoid getting stacked because the only factor that would lead to that is Brandon not calling the jam with enough straights and trips. But realistically, assuming that Brandon thinks Justin is capable of having bluffs in that spot, it's probably pretty difficult to imagine him just folding every single straight and just only calling with a full house. So in reality, probably pretty tricky to avoid getting stacked here, and certainly completely impossible to ever find a fold of any kind because it's unreasonable to fold a hand that strong. So, very interesting hand, interesting breakdown. This one was fun to look at, and let me know, of course, if you guys would like to see more hand breakdowns here using some of these hands that we can find in the YouTube streets. That's going to be it for this video, so thanks everybody for watching. If you'd like to talk about this content, you can find me on the GTO Wizard Discord server. I will also be publishing videos on my own channel, Poker Fluency, so you can go check that one out. And of course, in the meantime, to tide you over, here's another video from myself on the Wizard YouTube channel. So until next time, everyone, good luck and keep crushing.